I'm Judd Myers.
I'm Scott Tipton.
Welcome to Blastoff.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Blastoff podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Tipton, talking at you. This week, school is in session on one of our home shows. First off, in Comics 101, I'll be telling you all about one of the greatest cartoonists who ever lived, Will Eisner. Then, in Retails, Judd will teach us a lesson about the things we take for granted in Los Ojos son el espejo de alma. Let's get to it.
The history of comic books, the characters you love, and the people who created them. This is Scott Tipton's Comics 101.
Actively writing, drawing, and publishing comics from 1936 until his death in 2005, Will Eisner is the closest thing there is to the patron saint of comics. One of the founding fathers of the Golden Age, Eisner created and worked on characters and series from a variety of publishers. In 1940, Eisner created his trademark character, the Spirit, which was tremendously popular and saw an exposure unprecedented in today's comics market, and which served as a venue for Eisner to develop and hone his craft, taking the standard adventure strip in countless new directions. When Eisner ended the Spirit in 1952, he turned to new ventures, creating the modern graphic novel with his landmark work A Contract with God, thus beginning a series of intensely personal works that focused on the simplest of humanity's pleasures and sins. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A 19-year-old Eisner cut his teeth in the comics biz in 1936, just as things were starting out. One of his first jobs was at the now-forgotten Fox Comics, creating the thinly disguised Superman knockoff Wonder Man at the behest of Fox's publisher, an assignment that soon found the young artist testifying at the lawsuit brought by National, alleging copyright infringement. When National prevailed in court, Eisner's days at Fox were over. Eisner partnered with Jerry Iger to create the Eisner and Iger Studios, a production house that provided comics material to a number of publishers, most notably Quality Comics, producing such features as Uncle Sam, Dollman, and Black Hawk. Some of the all-time greats in comics art got their start at E&I, including Lou Fine, Jack Cole, and Jack Kirby. Business was booming, but in 1939, Eisner got an offer he found hard to refuse. Eisner was approached by quality publisher Busy Arnold and Henry Martin, the sales manager for the Register and Tribune newspaper syndicate. The men had a radical idea. Concerned about the growing competition they faced from comic books for young readers, the men proposed that Eisner produce for them a weekly 16-page comic book, which would be syndicated nationwide, appearing in Sunday papers across the country. Wise beyond his years, Eisner saw the artistic and financial potential of this new venture and negotiated a partnership agreement granting him complete ownership of the characters and material, a move unheard of in comics publishing of the time. Eisner thought that it was his artistic ability that gave him the extra leverage to gain this kind of agreement, but as he later discovered, they were less concerned with quality than with reliability. After all, this would be appearing week after week, and Eisner was one of the few producers they thought able to pull it off. Eisner sold his half of E&I to Iger and threw himself into the new project. The 16-page section would be split into 3 features: 4 pages for Chuck Mazzagari's Lady Luck, 5 pages for Bob Powell's Mr. Mystic, and 7 pages for the feature Eisner himself would produce. Eisner had long thought that the comic book medium was capable of work much more sophisticated than was commercially viable in the monthly magazines. With a syndicated weekly newspaper release, Eisner now had access to an older, more adult reader and far more flexibility than was possible with a daily newspaper strip. He had gained the best of both worlds: the length and format of comic books, and the much larger and more mature audience of comic strips. For the lead feature, Eisner wanted a detective strip with a very vulnerable human protagonist, something miles away from the Supermen that were ruling over comics at the time. Eisner's hero, Denny Colt, wore no costume. Instead, he sported a blue suit, gloves, a fedora, and a domino mask. The flashy alias of the Spirit was added at the insistence of the syndicate, who wanted something a little closer to the mystery men of the day. In his premiere appearance, criminologist Denny Colt pays a visit to Central City Police Commissioner Dolan, letting him know that he's on the trail of criminal scientist Dr. Cobra. Colt tracks down Dr. Cobra, and in attempting to apprehend him is drenched in a mysterious chemical, seemingly killing him. Dolan and the police arrive on the scene and, assuming Colt is dead, haul him away to a waiting grave in Wildwood Cemetery. However, it turns out that the chemical only put Colt into a death-like state of suspended animation. A real bummer when he wakes up the next night 6 feet under. Presumed dead by the world, Colt assumes the identity of the Spirit to go after criminals beyond the reach of the police, taking up residence in a hidden HQ beneath Denny Colt's crypt in Wildwood Cemetery. Only Police Commissioner Dolan and his daughter Ellen know who the Spirit is and where he can be found. Commercially, the strip was an immediate success, with some newspapers citing a 10% gain in circulation as a result of the Sunday insert. The strip was entertaining and head and shoulders above anything else in crime comics, but nowhere near the heights it would later reach. In 1942, Eisner was drafted, but the Spirit, whose subscribing newspapers had tripled, continued right on schedule, with art by Lou Fine and scripts from Manly Wade Wellman, Dick French, and Jack Cole. It wasn't until Eisner came back to the Spirit after World War II in 1946 that the strip really began to hit its stride. Eisner was revitalized in returning to the work and began to alter his approach to the already innovative strip by varying his storytelling and not always utilizing the Spirit as a center of the story. In addition, Eisner couldn't afford the luxury of a traditional cover with only 8 pages to work with each week. Instead, Eisner began to use his opening splash page to immediately set the mood and draw the reader into the story, incorporating the Spirit logo somewhere in the background, often as part of the landscape. In the post-war years, Eisner began to treat the Spirit as an anti-hero, becoming less and less the straight-shooting good guy he is at the series' inception. Often the Spirit is only peripherally involved in his own adventures. Eisner focused on telling a wide variety of stories, from comedy to tragedy, parable to suspense, with only a brief appearance by the Spirit to keep the reader connected to the strip as a whole. Just as Eisner was experimenting with story, so was he experimenting with art as well. The storytelling became wildly different from week to week, mixing traditional panel-to-panel storytelling with prose sections, utilizing layout in brand new ways to convey sensations or sounds, at times breaking format entirely when the story called for it. Eisner also created a number of femme fatale for the Spirit to contend with. There was Sans Serif, a girl from Denny Colt's youth turned smuggler and black marketer, whom the Spirit can never bring himself to apprehend. There's also Lorelei Rocks, a modern-day siren with a voice that can kill. But no femme fatale can compete with Pagel, the gorgeous international Black Widow who moves from husband to husband, from scheme to scheme, sometimes pausing in her plans to either tempt the Spirit away from the righteous path, or occasionally to warn him of some dire threat about to befall him. Eisner's women were usually dangerous, sometimes tragic, and always damned sexy. Probably the most famous of the Spirit sections is The Story of Gerhard Schnabel from September 5th, 1948. Another of Eisner's luckless schlubs, Gerhard Schnabel is a 35-year veteran bank guard who is fired when he's unable to stop a robbery. Desperate to prove his value, Gerhard suddenly remembers that as a child, he discovered he could fly until his parents forbade it, insisting he be normal. Determined to show the world, Gerhard heads to the top of a nearby building, where the Spirit is coincidentally headed to stop the same bank robbers. Gerhard leaps off the building and indeed can fly, at least for a moment. Eisner uses full-page spreads to express the feeling of height when Gerhard is in flight, and as he does in many of his later stories, utilizes the narrator's voice to provide a bit of poetic irony. The story of Gerhard Schnabel is everything that made the Spirit great. Funny, whimsical, and tragic, with a spare but elegiac tone in narration, and breakthrough storytelling unlike any seen before. By 1952, skyrocketing paper and printing costs made the Spirit section no longer profitable, and the syndicate pulled the plug. They asked Eisner to keep the character alive in a daily strip, but he refused. He continued to work for the U.S. Army, writing and illustrating PS Magazine, a series of comic-style instruction manuals for enlisted men. Eisner spent the next 2 decades applying the comics form to education, instruction, and other pragmatic directions, as he himself put it. In 1978, Eisner was ready to return to storytelling, and did so in grand form with what most comics historians consider the first graphic novel, A Contract with God. A Contract with God was the first of Eisner's autobiographical graphic novels, telling stories of life in the tenements of the Bronx in the 1930s. Contract is made up of 4 stories, tales of lost faith, lost hope, despair, and coming of age, illustrated by a cartoonist at the height of his form, and with rough dialogue that rings true. The voices of immigrants not heard for 50 years speak out again through Eisner's pen. In 1986, Eisner published another autobiographical work, The Dreamer, about his early days trying to find work and success in the then burgeoning comic book industry. Eisner recants his own only slightly fictionalized telling of the founding of the E&I studio, the Wonder Man lawsuit, and his decision to jump to the syndicate. He also provides character studies of Jack Kirby, Lou Fine, Jack Cole, and other Golden Age greats. In The Building, in 1987, Eisner tells the stories of 4 different residents of a New York building, how their lives intermingle without ever knowing it, and how, after death, their spirits remain a part of the structure, even after it's been demolished. Often overlooked by readers, The Building may be Eisner's best single work, combining the authenticity and heart of his autobiographies with the unmatched plotting and storytelling skills he demonstrated in The Spirit. Highly recommended. Though advancing in years, Eisner's productivity continued unabated. In To the Heart of the Storm, Eisner returned to autobiography with a much more ambitious work, devoting attention to his father's youth in Vienna and his own struggles growing up as a Jewish kid in a predominantly Italian and Irish neighborhood. After signing a long-term contract with DC Comics to keep all of his works in print, including the entire run of The Spirit, Eisner produced 3 major works, putting to shame contemporaries 1/3 his age. In 2000, Eisner's Last Day in Vietnam told the small stories of military life in wartime, gleaned from Eisner's own military experience, as well as field trips to Korea and Vietnam during his stint producing PS Magazine. In the same year, Minor Miracles comprised Eisner's retellings of the tales of modern folklore passed on to him by his family growing up. Eisner's following book, The Name of the Game, in 2002, was a generational novel about a wealthy Jewish family and their attempts to gain social advantage through marrying the right people. The Name of the Game expands on some of the themes touched upon by Eisner as early as A Contract with God, and does so with vitality, wit, and Eisner's ever-improving sense of draftsmanship and design. In his final work, in 2005, The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Eisner tried to raise public consciousness of anti-Semitism with his exploration of a 100-year-old hoax that falsely accused Jewish leaders of planning to take over the world. Primarily a historical piece, The Plot has none of the heart that made Eisner's other work so powerful, but the artwork is astonishing. The work of a man who spent a lifetime developing his craft. Will Eisner passed away January 3rd, 2005, at the age of 87. He left behind a legacy unprecedented in the comic book industry, and a body of work to be studied for decades to come by those who look to learn at the feet of the master. Not all great stories happen in the pages of a comic book. Some of them happen in the store. Welcome to Judd Meyer's Retails.
Carlos is an intelligent, soft-spoken man, well-dressed, manicured, and obviously educated. He's a teacher by trade and a family man. He's got 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Diego attends Cal State Northridge University and is aiming for a PhD someday. Pilar is still in high school and struggles with her grades. No matter who they're developing into, he's so very proud of them. His wife, Elena, is regal in her beauty, and she wears her devotion to her family on her sleeve. I call him the professor, which amuses him greatly. Like many other men from his era, he lives his life vicariously through his growing children, and he tries his best to instill in them some of the joys he experienced in his youth. Some they respond to, others they don't. I've watched his children grow, shy and quiet to outgoing and headstrong. They're good people, and so welcome in my store. Diego loves Marvel, and no matter how hard I try, he refuses to see the joys of DC. Pilar loves Fables and could care less about super people. We experience so many who visit our store as a family unit. They make their random forays a communal adventure. Maybe it's a Sunday when they're out for brunch. Maybe they'll stop in before heading to the mall to spend far too much money on Pilar at the Gap or Abercrombie. Carlos is one of hundreds of comic book fathers who represent a role model for their children, introducing them to the joys of comics and the positive influences of reading. He deals with many challenges as a husband and father. He does his best to be a wise influence and to ultimately be a better man than his father before him. But there's one challenge that consistently nags at him, one that hasn't stopped him from excelling in his professional life, but still seems to cause a great deal of personal heartache when it comes to his passion for his childhood hobby. Carlos is blind, and has been since he was 12 years old. A degenerative ocular disorder skipped 2 generations and made its way into his bloodstream. In a matter of just a few years, he went from glasses to bifocals to tunnel vision, and then entered a life of darkness. And unlike the miracle that defines Matt Murdock in his beloved comic books of old, the real world of genetic blindness takes up residence in a normal human being, and barring scientific breakthrough, stays for a lifetime. Like myself, and most of you listening to this podcast, Carlos was a manic comic book aficionado. He would tear through every issue he could get his hands on and read them until they came apart at the staples. His comics were an escape from the far from euphoric life in his father's home. We have much in common, the two of us. Other than the fact that Carlos is far more intelligent and educated than I, more wealthy than I ever hoped to be, and has more bravery and strength in his pinky than I have from head to toe, we're exactly alike. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like for him. I insist. At 8 years old, Carlos lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with his mother, father, and 3 brothers. He slept in the living room beside his older, torturous brothers and experienced not one moment of privacy. Madre worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, and Padre took what painting work he could find while resisting the temptation of the bottle. He rarely succeeded. A small closet in the hallway and a hidden flashlight provided him a doorway into another world. Hours spent lost in the darkness, imagining what it would be like to live in Xavier's mansion, to have a room of his own in the Baxter building, to experience the freedom of flight. The darkness represented comfort, an escape from the light of his father's kitchen. Within only a few years, that same darkness would prove itself a silent enemy. When his eyesight began to fail, his parents struggled to pay for his glasses. They struggled to pay for the doctor bills and for the tests he sorely needed. They struggled with the fact that they'd never be able to afford the experimental treatments that might have prolonged his seeing life. I knew it was getting worse and worse, he told me. Even at that young age, something in me knew what I was in for. For 4 years, I read everything I could get my hands on. Didn't matter what it was. Day and night I read. If I was going to slip into the dark, I needed to cover as much ground as I could, and time was short. I recall my mother crying constantly and wishing she would stop because I couldn't concentrate and would lose my place on the page. When the darkness finally took him, he had to learn how to read all over again, not with his eyes, but with his fingers. These days, Braille is something of an archaic skill, Carlos told me. But back then it was still on the cutting edge and one of the few ways children had to keep themselves literate. We all enjoy spending time in our local comic book stores chatting about our memories, don't we? Reminiscing about that first comic book we ever read. Well, for Carlos, a different memory haunts him. Not the first comic he ever laid eyes on. The last. Uncanny X-Men number 50, said Carlos. It was the first appearance of a gorgeous green superhero. I remember holding a magnifying glass over the cover, strangely excited by this floating woman. She was bathed in green light and seemed to reach out to me. I didn't have the heart to tell him that very issue sat in the glass case in front of him, a glowing Polaris reaching for him still. There are thousands of novels written in Braille, scores of textbooks, biographies, fantasy, and science fiction, an endless array of books read aloud on tape and CD, machines that scan and speak text in robotic voices, all provide the blind ways to experience the joys of storytelling, a conduit for information and imagination. Carlos has certainly read more than most. You don't become a highly lauded professor without spending a majority of your life immersed in research and study. But there remains a form of literary entertainment that was taken from him, cruelly stolen at a tender young age. There are no comic books for the blind, Carlos told me. Sure, there are novelizations in Braille and books on tape, but there's just no way to show a person without sight the colors in comic panels. No way to follow the action with your fingers instead of your eyes. We spoke of the graphic audio series you can buy on CD or download on the internet. Carlos treasures them greatly. It's wonderful listening to the actors speaking the dialogue and narrators describing the action. I can imagine the colors and the excitement of it. But I constantly wonder who many of the supporting characters are and where they fit into the universe. I'm still a bit confused by it all. He laughed, and I assured him that most of us sighted folk who read it on the page were as confused as he was. Other than those audio CDs, there are no other ways for the blind to enjoy our hobby the way sighted people do. Computer programs that vocalize printed matter and on-screen text fail miserably when images come into play. How does a program describe a page of green lanterns exploding from the panels? Carlos and his family go to every comic book movie at least twice and own every single one on DVD. You and I might spend our time dissecting all that's wrong with every adaptation, analyzing each scene and scrap of dialogue. To Carlos, they're all perfection. He's listening to a comic book being acted out in front of him. And while he can't see every facial movement and static frame, his family helps him out, and the sound effects do the rest. You take what you can when you're in my situation, Carlos told me. Don't get me wrong, I don't see myself as handicapped. I'm as capable as anyone with sight, and I don't impose any limits on what I can achieve. It's just... His voice trailed off, and he was lost in thought. This is a man who exudes nothing but positive confidence. He's torn through life with vigor and tenacity. But for a brief moment, in my humble store on the boulevard, there was a crack in his armor. He looked straight up, as if he were trying to feel the entirety of my store in one breath. What I wouldn't give to be able to come to your store every week and enjoy the adventure like the rest of you, he said. I miss it. Elena put her head on his shoulder. She'd obviously heard this before. The square-shouldered, mature air about them melted away for a moment, and they became vulnerable. They stood inches from me and gave me a glimpse of their relationship behind closed doors. I felt both honored and embarrassed to be included. These are the moments I experience in my comic book store. Human beings shedding their skin, becoming their true selves, safe in the knowledge that none will judge, and all four walls are safe. It never fails to take me by surprise. I bear witness to it all, and feel great pride that a comic book store can transform itself into sacred ground. Carlos gathered himself, the little boy retreating and the strong man assuming control. I feel blessed to have the memories of those old comic books. I can picture all of the superheroes on the movie screens. I can see the costumes when I listen to the narrated books. I can use my imagination and call on all of the panels I remember seeing as a boy. I had my sight for 12 years and have something to draw on. So many others have never seen Superman's cape or Spider-Man's webs. For them, description doesn't do it justice. He is a shining example of how adversity can become triumph. Were we all that strong and wise, our world would be a much greater place. Every week, 52 per year, all of us comic book aficionados flip through our funny books and voice our opinions. We criticize and play backseat driver with the stories, the art, the editorial. We threaten to drop this title or hate that artist. We analyze and scrutinize and come up with all sorts of ways our comics could entertain, excite, and impress us more. We take it all for granted, is what we do. We imagine ourselves to be as invulnerable as the characters on the page, as if there's no chance that anything could ever be taken away from us. And even if it were, we'd always have our comics to make us feel better. Take a moment this week as you walk the new release racks. Stop for one brief second and really look at the books you're buying. They're colors and words on a page. You may see flaws and misspellings and anatomical errors. You may see annoying advertisements and marketing ploys and sleight of hand. Regardless of your distaste for its asking price or your frustration over the direction the storyline is taking, those bright, colorful, precious pages are things to be savored, to be admired, to be seen. Abre los ojos. The Blastoff podcast is produced by the Colonel, Jeff Fox, Scott Tipton, and me. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Anthony Gray. You can find more of his musical compositions on his website, derekanthonygray.com.
For more information about anything you've heard us talk about today, check us out online at blastoffcomics.com. We have an active Facebook presence, so check us out over there on Facebook. And you can reach us on Twitter at blastoffcomics or on Instagram.
Or you can come by our retail location in North Hollywood in the heart of the Arts District, 5118 Lankershim Boulevard in North Hollywood, just 2 blocks south of Magnolia. See you soon.